Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone. Hope you are all happy and healthy. You are on the right channel for the Road 2020, the Resilient Leader program. So welcome everyone to the first session of the global webinar series, one of the core components of the Road 2020 program co-hosted by the TIJ, Thailand Institute of Justice, and the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School, or IGLP. So this webinar series is specially designed to bring up key issues and challenges to our discussions to see the impacts on the rule of law principle and policy-making process. So for the benefit of those who were absent last time, on the orientation day, please allow me to remind you our house rules. First, please keep your cameras on as much as you can. This is to enhance our interactive moments together. Second, please turn off your microphones. And thirdly, please rename your Zoom to your real name so we can locate you. As always, if you have any difficulties, please let us know. If you have any problem via the Zoom chat, our team will assist you as soon as possible. สำหรับท่านที่ต้องการรับฟังการบรรยายเป็นภาษาไทยนะคะสามารถที่จะกดปุ่ม interpretation นะคะซึ่งเป็นรูปโลกอยู่บริเวณด้านล่างของเมนูในจอ Zoom ของเราตอนนี้นะคะแล้วสามารถเลือกให้เป็นภาษาไทยได้ค่ะแล้วก็กดคลิกไปที่ mute original audio ได้เลยค่ะ Previously we have been discussing a concept of the rule of law under the UN SDG framework by Nicolas by UNDP. Today, we will explore how the global governance and multilateral partnerships has been reshaped after the COVID-19 impact and how would it be relevant concerning the rule of law principle. So for today's agenda, we will start off with our director of the IGLP, our key partner in this workshop, Professor David Kennedy, who will be laying down the foundations and also overview of today's topic, global governance and multilateralism. Following that, we will move on to today's panel discussion, which we are very honored to welcome our panelists from the IGLP faculty network, who will be joining us from different parts of the world. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor David Kennedy, the director of the IGLP, to guide us through today's topic before handing over to Professor Ann Orford for the highlight discussion of today. Professor Kennedy, please.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the first IGLP TIJ webinar in our series this year. I described these when we met during the orientation period as opportunities to think in very different ways about conventional policy problems faced by resilient leaders in a variety of different locations. The idea is there's a conventional way of confronting a variety of issues, whether it's criminal law reform, understanding multilateralism, the most local thing, the most global thing. And what it makes a resilient leader is being able to think in an alternative way, being able to invent new ways to use conventional tools and being able to reframe issues in a variety of different perspectives. And so I'm very pleased that we're going to have the opportunity to do that, thinking about multilateralism today. And there's a conventional way of thinking about multilateralism, that there are certain problems that are global problems. They're best handled by global institutions, by the UN system and other multilateral institutions. We know what those problems are, we know what those institutions are, and the question is only when to use them and whether to use them. But the question of what in today's world is global and what is local, how the differences between global and local things can be mapped, what it is that holds the global together, when a problem might be much more easily and readily resolved at a national or local level, all those things are up for grabs and under discussion today. And so to take us into that discussion, we have a wonderful team of leading voices from the IGLP faculty network, led by Professor Ann Orford from the University of Melbourne. All of our participants in the panel discussion today have experience in multilateral institutions and thinking about multilateralism in diverse ways. And I look forward to the different perspectives that I know they'll bring to the conversation. So they'll enter into a conversation among themselves, directed by Professor Orford, who has a variety of her own very interesting ideas to share with you about this. And then after a discussion among them, we'll open it up for question and answers from you. And at the end of the session, I'll be back with Anne to see if we can draw some general themes out of the conversation. Look forward to a robust conversation. And now over to you, Anne.
Thank you, David. So I'm Anne Orford. I'm a professor of international law here at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And as we're beginning by thinking about the relation between local and global, I will begin with a local convention. I will begin, as we begin all public events here in Melbourne, by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting and speaking tonight, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So I'm the chair of this evening's panel discussion on the theme of global governance and multilateralism. And I'm delighted to be joined by three colleagues who have a wealth of experience on these issues. Professor Martti Koskenniemi, who is Professor of International Law and Director of the Erik Kästrin Institute at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Professor Nicolas Rajkovic, who is Professor and Chair of International Law and Head of the Department of Public Law at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And Professor Gerry Simpson, who holds a chair in public international law at the London School of Economics in the UK. So the format for our discussion is as follows. We'll structure the first hour of the evening around a discussion between the participants that we've organised around four themes. The first is a deceptively simple question of what we take global governance and multilateralism to be. So what we think we're talking about when we talk about those things. The second is the role of law in this world of global governance and multilateralism. The third is the place of geopolitics in the current global governance climate. And the final is the role of global governance and multilateralism in responding to global crises, the current pandemic being the most obvious of them to I think most of us at present, but the climate emergency being another, financial crises, and so on. In the second part of the webinar, for about 20 minutes, we will have time for questions from you. And you will be invited either to ask those questions through the chat function. I think we're all very familiar with this after almost a year of webinars, or else raising your hand to ask a question live. So let's get going then with this first exercise of mapping global governance and multilateralism. So the question that we're going to begin with is what multilateralism is and how it relates to global governance. So multilateralism in English is a word that means multi or many and lateral or sides. And traditionally, when we think about these many sides or these many parties, we tend to think about them being states. So conventionally, multilateralism we'd think about as involving a world of states, a public sphere, the public international law, and diplomats doing their thing. And we often think about a particular set of institutions when we think about this kind of multilateralism. So we might think about the United Nations, most obviously. We might think about the World Bank Group, the IMF, maybe the WTO. Writing in the 1990s, Harvard professor Anne-Marie Slaughter suggested that we had it all wrong if we were thinking about global governance like that. So maybe, she said, global governance already existed, but it wasn't where people expected to find it. So she said we should look at government networks of regulators or counterterrorism officials or intelligence officials or banking regulators, that these more horizontal networks were the real world of global governance. And increasingly, we're also seeing non-state actors or private actors involved in something that looks a bit like multilateralism, and which they've taken to calling multi-stakeholderism, just to make us have even more difficult words to manage. And here we might think of the World Economic Forum holding its 51st meeting this week in Davos, or at least virtually in Davos. And so there we see something that looks like the kind of UN world, but that's led by business leaders with a part to be played by government leaders and civil society. So I'd like to begin by asking each of the panelists to offer us your sense of how we should understand multilateralism and global governance, either in terms of where you think it really is, or what you think the preferable way to think about global governance and multilateralism should be. And Nicolas, I'd like to invite you to begin.
Thank you very much. And to our Thai host, Sawadee Kap. Hello to you. So I think it's a great way to start off the discussion. I would suggest that the term multilateralism isn't just a term, it's a grammar. So and all grammars are about structuring the correct way in which one expresses meaning. And so if you recognize multilateralism as a grammar, not just a word, that's tied into a language. And what's that language? It's modern cartography, a symbolic language. And here's what's interesting, you know, the modern is supposed to be free of our kind of traditional past, but modern cartography is very much an iconic image in the universal of the globe. And we've come to associate this language of modern cartography as telling us what are the actors. So it's the visual capture of who are the actors, what is the public, what is not the public, what is the private. And so multilateralism as a grammar tells us how to read this modern cartography of language. Now, we run into the problem today, and I think what Anne has illustrated with the discussion of Anne-Marie Slaughter, is that the actual practices, the lived experience of governing has really separated from this language and grammar of what multilateralism structures us to believe that global governance is. And so the problem we run into is we are trying to use a particular grammar, and maybe we need to appreciate that grammars can change, because grammars do change, and that languages evolve. And can be modified, can be mutated and amended. So in this way, the challenge here is that modern cartography gives us a script of the global, a particular narrative of the global, which relies on these particular cartographic language and grammar rules. And that is kind of the distinction that we have now, is the practices that we observe. We could generate different types of maps about the global, multiple. In fact, you could say we have polymapping that takes place, right? But we're in a tradition where no, there is one map, right? And so I think one of the hurdles is getting over that, to see that the global governance consists of a multiplicity of practices in a variety of maps. And maybe it's actually not so important that they all are reconciled on one map, and that or in this sense, the universal. So that would be my contribution to this point.
Great, thank you. So Martti, Nick's just mentioned the world of actual practice and lived experience of governing, and suggested that doesn't match any longer with our language. So you've had some long experience with this practice, and you have been associated with the Foreign Office of Finland, and also with the United Nations when you were with the Security Council, the Finnish delegation to the Security Council. So do you have a sense of how we should think about multilateralism. Is there a kind of proper way that we should be approaching it that's being undermined by this kind of privatization and this move to multiplicity of multilateralisms? Or do you kind of welcome that sense of an expanding world of multilateralism?
Well, thank you very much, Anne, for that question. It's true that I've spent most of my professional career in institutions that are related to the United Nations. Most recently, the International Law Commission some years ago. And when the theme multilateralism and global governance is presented to me, I see that as a problem. So it's a presentation of a problem or of two identities, or as Nick Rajkovic would probably say, two grammars that do not quite square very well with each other. And that set of questions, it raises a set of questions which can be also characterized, as many have done, as complexity, but which may be better characterized in terms of some sort of tension or struggle between various actors and various institutions out there somewhere in the world that we call international, and a world to which we sometimes use the grammar of multilateralism, sometimes that of globalization. You mentioned in your question a little bit suggestively the word privatization. So that's one angle to that complex of questions and grammars that the tension between multilateralism and globalization indicates. I'm not sure if that covers all or even the most important aspects of what goes on in international governance, but it certainly is one of the important features of it. So from my perspective, the world of tensions that, again, I come to this basic tension between multilateralism and globalization. The most interesting and important feature there, I suppose, is the diversification of the various institutional avenues that are available for political and legal action out there. So when I used to work as a diplomat in a foreign ministry, going into UN meetings, coming back to the capital, going again to UN meetings. And I now look back on that, that seemed a tremendously narrow professional and legal avenue and a set of questions. Nowadays, when one participates in institutional activities, which we usually call governance, one goes from trade bodies to financial meetings to human rights institutions or even courts to international environmental conferences. And although it's true that private actors have also intervened those fora in a way that they maybe didn't 20, 30 years ago, I think to group them up as merely private actors loses the sense in which they represent interests, larger interests in which there's nothing private or whose treatment as private is not really very useful. I just give the example of the recent actions by Facebook and Twitter in regulating who can speak in the public realm. Now, in some sense, these are private institutions operating out there, but that specific vocabulary or grammar isn't particularly helpful in finding a way to deal with that. So to summarize, and I think I share Nick's sense that to talk in terms of grammars is helpful, but above all, what he also was suggesting, that this is a world of great complexity. It's not just an architectural complexity. It is a complexity in which political interests, questions about distribution, struggle for power is quite central. And so I want to question the tranquil and, how would I put it, geographic metaphor that he was using.
Thank you. So, Gerry, Nick was talking about finding a language or a correct way of expressing the practice of global governance. And Martti was suggesting that there's a very narrow way to conceptualize what goes on that maybe misses some of the experience of global governance. I know that your work has looked both at history and also at literature as different ways of grasping what the experience of global governance is. So I wonder if you have a different sense of how we might map or try and convey what's involved in multilateralism and global governance.
Yeah, thanks, Anne, and thanks, David, and the Thailand Institute of Justice for inviting us here. Let me say something about multilateralists here. My sense recently is that COVID has induced among global experts a kind of nostalgia or longing for multilateralism. And this could have something to do, at least, with a warm glow coming off the Biden presidency. So the story goes a bit like this. I mean, David asked us to think about conventional and unconventional ways of thinking through multilateralism. Well, a sort of conventional way of thinking about it at the moment is that and here I want to say something about COVID, that the very multilateralism of the virus somehow negotiating its way across borders, exploiting globalization, sidelining sovereigns, might somehow be a model for a political multilateralism that does the same. So the idea was to sort of become COVID or emulate COVID and transcend national borders. And you heard a lot of this at the General Assembly last October, where there were statements like, we can work better together, we are stronger together, we must control our destiny multilaterally. So the pandemic seemed to somehow be a reminder that globalization had not gone far enough, or the answer was more multilateralism. And I suppose I would strike, in the sort of spirit of this conversation, I'd strike three very brief cautionary notes about all of that. And this may connect to something that Martti said. The first is that multilateralism is a choice. You know, it's a decision to do something with certain people at a certain level in order to advance certain interests. It's not some sort of free-floating good idea that we need to adopt or a desirable destination that we have to reach. But I get the impression that some multilateralists don't like to think of multilateralism in this way. For them, it's more a matter of good manners or right thinking or even selfless virtue. So a lot of respectable, serious internationalism is like this and possesses a kind of syllogism. Global problems need global solutions. But as Martti said, what is a global problem and why would it require a global solution? The second is, and I'll be brief with this one, the second is that the definitions of multilateralism are highly contested. I mean, there are so many different ways to be multilateral at the UN, outside the UN, in private fora, in public places, with your friends, with everyone, legally, extra-legally, or illegally. So when I hear people use the phrase multilateral intervention, I never quite know what they mean. Do they mean sort of a group of states intervening, or intervention by like-minded allies, or authorized by some public body, or just an intervention I happen to favor? And then the third and final point I'd make is, and I can elaborate on this later, that COVID may also end up having a chastening effect on these ideas of multilateralism, or support for this conventional idea of multilateralism, or for Euro-American practices of internationalism, because it turns out that the WHO might have made some mistakes too, or the international expertise was itself ambiguous, or because of some loss of faith in a particular species of global governance, or because, and this goes to something that's been said already, or because it's become even more apparent that we are always somehow operating in some inscrutable space between the national and the international and the private and the public.
Great, thank you all. So with that sense of the many ways we might think about global governance and multilateralism, so the idea that it's really not some settled set of institutions or practices, but a more shifting field, I now want to open up the question of where law is in this story, because this group of people are largely experts in law. So where then would we look to find law in this account of multilateralism and global governance? So this might be something that we think about descriptively, where we would place law in this story. So, and what we're looking for if we're looking for law. So do we look for international law in the form of treaties? Are we looking for private law in the form of contracts? Are we thinking of something more like a culture that Martti Koskenniemi's made famous in the language of a culture of formalism? Or might we be looking for something else altogether? Law as a set of arguments, law as a solver of problems. Or is law possibly a creator of problems as well? So we often look to law as if it's going to solve global problems, but of course, international law has also been involved in producing many of those problems. So the question might be, if we're looking for law in this story, are we looking for law as to see where its place is? But there's also another account of law, and I've gathered that you've been talking about it already in your program, and that is the sense of a rule of law, a political idea that law is somehow something that can offer us perhaps an escape from politics or a way of taming politics, maybe an outside to nationalism that's more virtuous. So this is more of a normative discussion about where law should be in global governance. So in many of the current discussions about the apparent failures of multilateralism, we hear, for instance, that the problem is national rivalries or authoritarian politics, or controlled by unaccountable experts, or maybe captured by private powerful corporations. And often the answer is more law as a solution. So more court cases to help bring a right to the environment, or more courts in general, or more treaties to regulate behavior, or more regulations. So how should we think about law? Where should we look for law? Is law part of the problem, or is it part of the solution? Martti, could I invite you to please give the first response?
Well, maybe I could start from where we were left off, more or less, highlighting the complexity of the globalization, multilateralism nexus. And you added to the complexity by juxtaposing a descriptive and a normative notion of law. And as I suppose Gerry said, well, this is a field of choices again. We have these alternative vocabularies. It's not as if there were one law, which we would just have to understand and then apply or do whatever we want to do with it and then succeed. No, we have to choose our notion of law. And if one looks at literature, if one looks into past history of the ways in which people have employed the idiom of law, one finds a bewildering variety of ways to think about law. None of this is to undermine what you said earlier in analytically juxtaposing the descriptive and the normative parts of law. Let me just take a couple of themes. Well, a first theme in this discussion is often, is law marginal or central? And then lawyers tend to think, oh, it's very important. And let's say economists think, well, it's not that important at all. And what sort of a tool is it? I would say in this case, both sides are right. So there clearly are laws which are pretty marginal to the way in which the world operates, although we have come to think about them as important. I'm thinking of institutions such as the International Court of Justice, let's say, or the International Criminal Court, or maybe also some aspects of public international law that regulate diplomatic correspondence and meetings, etc. In some sense, that part of law has been there for a long time, but it's not really very important for the way the world has come about. Or if you want to be a political actor in the world, it's not that you want to file a case in the International Court of Justice and think that the world will be changed. You might want to do that for some reasons. There would be sometimes excessive cost involved, but it might not be the way to change the world really. But there is another type of law which we tend to forget, which is the law that frames the world in which alternatives are given to us from which to choose. So this is the world which underlies much of the economic transactions that we carry out, that underlies the world of financial cooperation between states, or that underlies also the alternatives that diplomacy and economic actors have in the world. I'm thinking of the law that tells us that the world is divided into sovereign states, and the sovereign states have jurisdiction and competence, that there is, against this public world of statehood, there is a private world in which people contract, and those contracts should be held binding, and that there are corporations that have what lawyers call a legal personality, and we sometimes juxtapose, like in recent interest in investment law, we juxtapose the private world of the corporations with the public world and the state. We tend to think of these things as somehow natural or obvious. Well, maybe they are in some sense, but they are deeply legal. They are the legal grounding on which most of globalization or multilateralism works. So I wanted to make this point, not only because I'm a lawyer and want to say that, well, being a lawyer is really an important person, but in order to help us look more deeply into the way in which the structure of the world is organized, and above all, the world in which some things are presented to us as problems, whereas other things do not seem problems at all, but merely part of the natural background of our activity. So, and it's a lengthy answer to your really good question. I think what I've been saying has both a normative and a descriptive aspect to it. It puts those two together. But I always think that it's really important to get away from this analytical obsession of separating the way we think about how the world is and the way we want to think it should be, separating those two things together. It's better to keep them tightly together.
Thank you, Martti. So Martti's drawn our attention to which aspects of law we make visible and which we accept as part of the background. But in that story, law is still fairly central to multilateralism and global governance. So Gerry, you're somebody who said that we sometimes make law too central. In fact, you infamously, and I've heard a number of government lawyers really scandalized by this, say that we should perhaps sometimes do some gardening rather than being lawyers, which I think a lot of people may have taken up when we've been in lockdown. So I wonder if you could speak a little to where you see law in this story and how central you think law should be.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I was very struck by something you said in our discussion on email, and it reminded me of a talk I'd given at the European Society of International Law in Naples a few years ago. I was on the final panel, and I gave a talk called Against Moreness, which was really about the tendency of lawyers, or many international lawyers, to believe that the solution to problems of global governance and problems of multilateralism was simply more of something, in particular more law. So more institutions, more courts in particular, more legal principles, more doctrine, and so on and so forth. And we've seen this proliferation of institutions over the last 30 years in the name of this project. And I mean, I even picked it up the other day when I was doing some background research on COVID. I gathered that somebody had suggested that the People's Republic of China should be sued at the ICJ, just going to Martti's point, they should be sued at the ICJ for some breach of the WHO constitution. And that seems to me as of moreness taken to an extreme, the idea that an international court could somehow adjudicate coronavirus or COVID. That seems to me to be a mistake, or at least it's a mistake to assume that we always need more. I guess the second tendency I see in people who speak about the rule of law is that this idea that the law is something that's always to come somehow. The rule of law hasn't quite arrived yet. It's something to work towards with more law. And instead, it might be better to shift the temporality of this and ask what it is that the rule of law has already wrought, to sort of look out into the world and see law at work. And again, just to take it from a British perspective at the moment, I think COVID to a certain extent has taught us that mass death can coexist quite happily with the rule of law in the UK, and it's undoubtedly true of the international system as well.
Thanks, Gerry. So Nicolas, I wonder if you could give us your sense of this question, how we should think about law in the multilateral global governance space, and how we think about its centrality, marginality, or otherwise.
Thanks, Anne. Well, I'd say that the answer has kind of been staring at us in the face with the saying of rule of law. We've just kind of put and so I say this both as a lawyer and I guess as an IR person, we've always kind of put the cart before the horse. It's always about rule. And there are different types of rule, and what role does law play within rule? And it's not within this binary caricature to say that rule is politics. No, rule is something far more complicated than putting a politics law opposition. Everything's about rule. And so what's law's role in it, or what's law's place? I would suggest instead of saying place, let's talk about the space of law within rule. How is it mobilized? How is it used? And so I would, and then if I were to look at a little more closely at law in the context of, let's say, the struggle of rule or how one rules, I would say that it's an asset of inclusion and exclusion, but not asset in the material way. It's an amorphous asset. It's an institutional asset. It's a normative asset. It's a symbolic asset. It's a coercive asset. So in that way, it's the place of law is really the space of law. How is law being mobilized as this asset to shape the present and future of inclusion and exclusion in its many dimensions? So I would look at it that as an asset of inclusion and exclusion in a wider situation of rule.
So we've now had a couple of topics that have really been more about mapping the field. Now we'd like to turn to look at a couple of issues that have been very present in debates around global governance and multilateralism, both in the context of responses to COVID and more broadly in the shifting politics of our time. So the first of these themes looks at the question of geopolitics. So a lot of the discussion, at least that I'm reading in this part of the world, that the US would have us, I guess, call the Indo-Pacific, that used to be the Asia-Pacific area. There's a sense that multilateralism has been enlivened or hijacked by a new great power rivalry or a new Cold War or a new geopolitics. So that is by a kind of tension between the US and China. We've certainly seen a lot of discussions along these lines play out in relation to something mentioned by someone earlier, that is whether there was a failure of the World Health Organization in relation to COVID, and if so, whether that was because of a relationship to China. So perceived crises also at the World Trade Organization in responses to climate change, and more broadly, many are discussed in terms either of this great power kind of geopolitics, or even just in the sense that there's a rivalry between states. And often we hear that the response should be that we do hand things over to the private sector, imagined, I guess, as not a space of rivalry or competition. So often we hear this discussed as a crisis of the liberal international order, or a crisis of the rules-based international order, but that often seems to me just to be suggesting that the center of that order is maybe no longer reliably the US and its allies. We also hear a north-south version of geopolitics registering in current debates. For instance, I think today Oxfam released a new report called The Inequality Virus, suggesting that COVID may now be increasing inequality in every country in the world at the same time, never before seen, but also that there's a severe inequality in terms of access, for instance, to vaccines between states in the north and the south. And we've also seen this crisis unsettling a tendency to treat the US and Europe as the global standard for measuring expertise and governance capacity. And Gerry's mentioned that already in terms of the UK's response to COVID. So this kind of confident ranking of the US and the UK as the most well-governed states in relation to things like pandemics has really been put under pressure. So the question that we'd like to turn to now is how the rise of China and shifting geopolitics more broadly influences what multilateralism will look like and what global governance will look like from here on. And in my view, the current version of multilateralism that we've become used to has been an expression of a period in which there has been one dominant power and a period that I think has come to an end. So the question is whether multilateralism has all along been a form of disguised unilateralism, or perhaps North Atlanticism, or whether there was once a truly universalist ideal of multilateralism as a principle of governance that's now been lost, or whether it's really not useful to think at all in terms of geopolitics. Is that just an old Cold War idea that is really of no use in this current moment? So Gerry, could I ask you to kick this one off, please?
Yeah, so many great questions there, Anne. You know, we did have a discussion about whether we should even discuss the great powers or geopolitics, and I can see the point. Having heard all my adult life experts on geopolitics speak, I sometimes think it's the realm of the wrong answer, if you like. The answers always seem to be too overdetermined, too enamored of diplomatic elites, too detached from its objects of study, a place where somebody like Henry Kissinger has fated. So I've worked against that a bit throughout my life. I'm co-authoring a book right now which tries to tell the story of the Cold War, for example, without reducing it to, or even emphasizing particularly US and Soviet competition. Still, let me have a go at saying something meaningful about multilateralism and geopolitical thinking. Whenever I'm confronted by 100 fresh-faced international law students each year, they seem to have two ideas about geopolitics and global law. One is that international law and multilateralism are simply subject to capture by the great powers. It's all a cover for Western or European or Atlanticist domination of international institutions. But the other is that international institutions are places where the great powers can be somehow put in their place or worked against, or where grand schemes of world ordering can be enacted to counteract the dark maneuverings of the geopolitical elite. So I don't try and adjudicate that struggle. I just reenact it in the class in a way, and then I argue that we shouldn't see the great powers as somehow acting outside the system or with impunity, or think of everything in global politics as taking place in the shadow of great powers, because that undersells the power of private power, the centrality of ideas, the possibility of resistance, and frankly speaking, the law of unintended consequences, which operates in international law, and the sheer volatility of great power identity and preferences. But I think another question has arisen, and you asked it just a minute ago, about the location of the center of geopolitics. And it's partly related to the rise of China, the recession of American power, the fragmentation of European identity, yes. But I think we have a bit of a collapse of confidence now in places that understood themselves to be a kind of center. So that not only can the center not hold, it's no longer experiencing itself as a center. And to me, the coronavirus spread has sometimes felt like an accelerated version of this uncentering. I remember when I was about to travel to Singapore in March, people in London said, was it wise? You'd be safer at home, they said. 10 months later, the UK health minister was telling me it was best to assume that everyone I met in London had coronavirus. So we have a sort of state failure, infrastructural collapse in the West, and relatively successful medical political interventions elsewhere. So since then, and let me finish here and put this as a kind of provocation, maybe there's been a cultural, even moral shift in the understanding Europeans have about their place in the world. I mean, the Wuhan pneumonia is one thing, but the Sussex variation, and now we have Europeans denied entry to other states. So we've ceased to gaze out with our usual mixture of transient humanitarianism and inactive sorrowfulness. And instead, we are the subject of a sort of pitying gaze from elsewhere. And I think that could mark a kind of shift in the center of global cultural power, at least.
Thanks, Gerry. Nick, what are your thoughts on this question of how we should think, or should we think, about geopolitics at this moment?
Well, I would kind of build upon what I mentioned earlier with multilateralism. We inherit grammars and languages and concepts, and in this case, the thing there's two things I find interesting about geopolitics. One is that it was born as a predatorial concept. So it was born in the time at the turn of between the 1800s and 1900s, very much immersed in the so-called scramble for Africa, adopted by the Nazis for a policy, going to Kissinger. It has a very kind of coercive and predatorial history to it. And that's what we struggle with when we use the term. We go to these very atavistic predatorial struggles, and the term is deeply uncomfortable as an analytical term in some circles. But the interesting thing about geopolitics is all it means is earth politics. That's it. And by golly, I think we really are in an era of earth politics right now, but a very different kind from the geo that was understood when the term was initially created and then came to be subsequently practiced in the 20th century. So now all the concerns about climate change, the Anthropocene, we are very much in a very different type of era of geopolitics. And I mean, I'd laugh at myself when suggesting this, but maybe a hyphen's useful. Maybe we go geo-politics to try and develop this new history of geopolitics, because we are in a very different type of earth politics now. It's not totally unrelated to the past. There's nothing that's new. But yeah, I would say it's an earth politics that we need to pay attention to now.
Martti, I know that you were very skeptical about even thinking in terms of geopolitics, partly because of its history, the history, I think, to which Nick just drew our attention. Do you have any thoughts you wanted to share on this part of the discussion, or do you think we really should just reject this frame?
Let me produce a thesis. And the thesis is this, that in the past, a lot of misunderstanding, both willful and accidental misunderstanding, was caused by the use of the ideas of great power, primacy, and geopolitics. There was a sense that that vocabulary was so powerful that it could be used to annihilate every alternative vocabulary. And if I now hear that vocabulary raise its ugly head, so to say, once again, it's really hard to have a sympathetic view on it. Having said that, there's something else to be said, which is that, of course, like this conversation and many other conversations have shown, we do have great difficulty in understanding what happens in the world now. Those difficulties also involve choosing the language, or as Nick would say, the grammar, through which that understanding can be made possible. We have the language of multilateralism and the language of globalization. Now we have those of the older ones of realpolitik, of geopolitics, of great power, primacy, etc. As languages, they do throw some light, especially languages with resilience. They do throw some light to aspects of the world that are sometimes interesting and important, but they always leave other aspects of the world aside. In the global world or in the international world, one is invited to be multilingual. So we need to speak many languages in order to interact productively with other people, colleagues, friends, adversaries. And it's the same with these conceptual languages. So we should understand that none of them really grasps the final truth of the way the world is, but that they illuminate some really existing aspects of the world. So we have to be able to use all of them as, like when we change spectacles and what it is that we see. But of course, then remember that there are other ways of seeing as well. So we have to make a choice. And this is, I think, where, Anne, you started with the juxtaposing the normative and the descriptive. So where the normative and the descriptive come in some ways together, and which also provides a role for law. Whichever of these languages, multilateralism and the great institutions of the UN, globalization and the more varied financial, economic, and media institutions that are out there, great powers and questions about China, US, etc. Whichever of these analytical devices or languages or grammars we choose is not just about understanding the world, but also making our mark in that world, also providing to us a set of normative propositions about what's important and what's not important. What should we engage in? Which language should we use when we engage in our projects, etc. So rule of law, we didn't really get much to that topic. It's also a vocabulary, and it's also somehow important, but somehow also very partial. And I suggest that once we continue, as we will in these conversations in other fora and here, we should remember that the complexity of the rule of law prevents us from thinking that there is one such thing, and instead try to imagine how through those various languages and spectacles, if you wish, we can imagine a rule of law that deals precisely with the problems and which you identified, and which are the greatest problems we have, those of global inequality.
Thanks, Martti. So I should declare my hand here and say that I do find geopolitics a very interesting language to think with at the moment. And I've given a talk about this recently that is online on the UCL's website. It was a current legal problems talk, and it's called Regional Orders and International Law, the End of Geography or a New Geopolitics. And it's a response to a piece written by Daniel Bethlehem called The End of Geography, in which he argued that the state no longer makes sense precisely in the way Nick was talking about as a geospatial concept underpinning international law, He didn't then say that his answer was geopolitics, but I think we can hear both in his piece and in other work he's written, the expression of a UK sense of an expanded regional order. So he's the former legal advisor to the UK Foreign Office, and he's been developing very strongly a sense of an expanded sense of collective self-defense that is a kind of hegemonic expression of power. And he's been developing that along with the legal advisors from Australia and the US. In that talk, I also compare that way of thinking with the way that Chinese international lawyers and legal philosophers have begun conceptualizing the destiny of China as a power, as a rising power, and expressing that increasingly in the case of some legal philosophers in China through the language of Carl Schmitt's Großraum, which I think helps us to see one way in which Chinese lawyers are beginning to talk about a form of regional ordering that will be shaped by a moral destiny of China. So that talk goes for about an hour, so I won't embark on it now, or we won't finish this talk. And I do want to get onto our final theme, which is multilateralism and crisis, and indeed multilateralism in crisis. So we hear a lot about the need for multilateral cooperation to address global crises or global public goods, to respond to financial crises, climate crises, to inequality, to global pandemics. So the assumption is often that multilateralism or global governance must respond to these global crises or these global problems. And it's a given that the crises or the problems are global somehow. So when does a crisis or a problem become a global crisis or problem? And what are the effects of deciding that a problem requires a global response? So these are very abstract ideas. So too, of course, are the other concepts we've been talking about, like the rule of law. These are very abstract claims, which are then used to justify very concrete actions, decisions, choices, forms of distribution. And what of the related claim that the scale of the problems we now face has led to a crisis of global governance itself that requires new solutions? So you'll perhaps know that the World Economic Forum has claimed in the face of COVID that we need a great reset, like a kind of poor man's great transformation. It's going to be led by the philanthropists and the global foundations and the business leaders, and they'll probably let some government leaders and NGOs be involved. And they're going to solve all of these crises because global institutions have proved incapable of doing it. Of course, we might also think that global governance, either in the public or the private form, has produced financial crisis or climate crisis or inequality or indeed global pandemics at our most dystopian. So what do we make of all these claims? Are we living through a period of crisis? Are we living through a period of transformation? Are we living through a great reset? And Nicolas, I'll ask you to begin again, please.
Thanks, Anne. Well, I would say the epidemiological crisis that the virus has brought upon us has just added fuel to a growing epistemological crisis. And so in this case, epidemiology we're all familiar with. We had a crash course on it the past year. But here, epistemology is about how do we know what we know, right? And in this case, that has been profound in our understanding, or what we thought was our understanding of the global, what we thought was our understanding of borders, what we thought was our understanding of boundaries, what we thought was our understanding of threats, of security, right? So all of this has been thrown into flux. And so the crisis in that sense is a crisis of meaning. And then because meanings are acted upon and they structure our frameworks of what we believe to be peace, prosperity, and security. So in that sense, I would say the crisis is quite profound now, because our foundations of what we thought we knew about security, peace, law, order, multilateralism have been shaken. And so, as I said, I think multilateralism is a grammar. Grammars evolve. Cartography is a language. Languages evolve. Nothing new is ever truly new. And then we have to make choices, I think, as Martti said, about, how do you go on? How do you get through the epistemological crisis, the vertigo that you might be experiencing? There are options, but you need to recognize that you are in a crisis of how do you know what you know? But you can make your way through it if you're prepared to evolve the grammars and languages that you inherit. If you aren't, you're stuck. And so that's how I would look at it. I think the crisis is one profoundly of knowing what we know and being able to do something about it.
Thanks, Nick. Martti.
Yes, well, in normal circumstances, I would say crisis is really an overused word. But I suppose that standard response doesn't really apply with the COVID situation that we have. I think it's legitimate to call that a crisis, but I would also suggest that it puts to shadow those innumerable other moments in which people have called things crises, merely in order to see an opportunity open.
I think someone's got their mic on. If you
Okay. So anyway, so I wanted to say that crisis is always an opportunity, and especially for lawyers. So we don't have the tools to analyze the medical, epidemiological nature or what to be done with this crisis, but we do have the tools to analyze the opportunities that this crisis opens. And I suppose there are two aspects of this. On the one hand, we must be wary of suggestions that are being made very rapidly by powerful institutions and actors that now finally they must show their ability to operate more efficiently than the existing institutions have been able to do, because undoubtedly there have been problems. The discussions within the WHO, for instance, which are undergoing, have shown not only that the institution itself was rather weak and continues to be rather weak, but also that the political interests in depicting the institution in one way or another are enormous, and the stakes that are involved in such depictions are really important as well. So I would say, as pessimistic it is, I don't see there much of an opportunity that should now present itself and we should grasp out of the existing propositions to deal with the crisis. The other thing is then, well, what should lawyers and lawyers interested in global affairs and organizing the International Institutional Forum then do? Well, I actually know some of the people in the WHO who have been involved with this, and it's hard to see another institution more reliable or more representative to work forward with the epidemiological challenges that lie ahead than precisely the old UN institutions and the WHO at its head. I certainly don't think that private institutions, private actors in the business era, they are obviously really important in this, but that the operations should be undertaken under their auspices. That's really a nightmare scenario. And finally, so coming from Finland, which is a state which has had its wars and its problems, it seems to me that that its role, that the role of the state for this group of people living under these, locked in this particular space, like for many other people locked in their spaces, the state really is an important institution through which to work and in which to work. There are many reasons to think that way. It's not because one should think that states are the only thing that there is, or that sovereignty and taking back control is tremendously important. On the contrary, but one always has to start somewhere. And the somewhere which we have, which does pertain to have a reasonably equitable distribution of tasks between the various institutional actors within itself, the state still is a good way to try to manage the crises that will rise in the future, as well as this, through the WHO also. Thanks.
Thanks, Martti. So, Gerry, the final word to you on this question. You've already talked a little bit, I think, on this point of how we think about global crises and why we think about them in those terms. Would you like to add something to conclude?
Yeah. I'll just leap on the back of these two sets of comments. I mean, one was something that Nick said about epidemiologists reminded me that during the Iraq War, almost all the epidemiologists I met became international lawyers. The international law was the language of that, if you like, crisis. Nowadays, I pass international lawyers on Hampstead Heath who are talking about herd immunity and genome sequencing. So there's been a sort of transference of expertise, or at least pseudo expertise around this. But something about Martti said about Finland reminded me of the situation here, where we have a crisis. It's a sort of crisis of sovereignty, but the question would be whether it's a productive crisis or not. And this actually partly goes to the question of naming and who gets to name and the grammar of naming. So in the United Kingdom, we've had this kind of extra constitutional power relocated from London to Edinburgh and Cardiff, for example, a kind of de facto self-determination, a self-determination that hasn't happened within international legal rules or even within constitutional norms in the United Kingdom. It's actually, it seems to me like a sort of power of renaming or a new linguistic gesture. I remember one morning waking up to discover that there was a place of great political interest in Britain called Greater Manchester, and Greater Manchester was beginning to throw its weight around. So the crisis has produced a sort of crisis for sovereignty itself. But the one other thing I wanted to say briefly about crisis is it reveals something about normality or everydayness. So we get told that we're going back to something called normalcy all the time in Europe. But in situations of normalcy, as we know, lots of people die of poverty and extreme inequality. And COVID seems to have somehow reintroduced us to death, or the everydayness of crisis and inequality, a sort of productive crisis, if you like, in that regard, at least.
Thank you, Gerry. So we've now come to the end of the 1 hour of discussion, fairly beautifully, almost to the minute of where we were supposed to end. So that is good news. And we now have 20 minutes in which we can take questions. I can see that some questions are in the chat now. As I understood it, they were going to be put onto a slide, is that correct? Or should I just be reading them from the chat function?
I will help you. I mean to locate. There is a first person. I mean for comments. May I call name? I mean for Miss Montira from UN Women, please.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much, and I thank you, professors. I really enjoyed the session today very much, especially when it comes to the way that you link multilateralism with the emerging issues of the fair distribution of the COVID vaccines. I'm Montero, I'm communication specialist of UN Women, and I'm actually on loan to the World Health Organization once. I left the organization, the World Health Organization, at the point where Thailand has just signed the AstraZeneca deal. But I heard the news yesterday from the BBC that now the vaccine supply has become a critical issue as a lot of countries in the EU pact seek to stem high, I mean, everywhere the countries are now trying to stem high infection rates everywhere. And you can see the death toll has surpassed 1.2 million worldwide. And the two main suppliers like AstraZeneca and Pfizer-BioNTech have both said the production problems may hamper their supplies, you know, and how they supplied expected number of even agreed number to the EU countries or around the world. And we heard in the news that the European leaders, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, is calling for a fair distribution. And the EU vaccine minister had warned the dead end of vaccine national. And all of the EU's leaders had somehow resonated to your point of view today on how the rule of law can play a critical role in fair distribution and promote the inclusivity, and somehow it can also be used as a tool of division. Let me give you another quote by the EU Commissioner, almost at the same time as the German Chancellor, and as well as the vaccine minister in the UK. She said, the EU Commissioner, I mean, she came and intervened how the two vaccines producers has said. They said, she urged, the EU Commissioner has urged the companies to provide early notification whenever they want to export vaccines to the third countries. To me, when I hear it, it seems like an political intervention and a nudge saying that, wait a minute, I think EU citizens is calling and is trying to drum up for the vaccine nationalism. And I'd like to get your point of view on how the rule of law and how multilateralisms and the fundamental multilateralisms, and however you're going to define it in your dictionary, would come into this and play as a fair referee in this fight of vaccine distribution. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Would somebody like to offer the first go at answering that, or would you like me to choose one of you, which I could also do? Nick, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'd approach the question, I've heard the term a lot about vaccine nationalism, but I think to get a little, I think what we're seeing is the securitization of vaccines, right? So the vaccines are at the intersection of what's perceived as security now, right? And so now the question is, right, how are different actors, or in this case, how is the EU using securitization? How is that interacting or not interacting with law of different sorts to manage this struggle over distribution that's taking place? So I think it's a bit of a misnomer to talk about it as vaccine nationalism. I really think it's now the word security and securitization gives us a little more insight now into, sorry to use the term, a geopolitical struggle over vaccine of a kind. So that's how I would characterize it. But how law works, I think, well, it's how does security and law interact both to facilitate better distribution, more egalitarian distribution, or exclusion. So law is an asset of inclusion and exclusion. Security is an asset of inclusion and exclusion. And we're witnessing it right before our eyes. Just, it's unfortunate the terms which are distracting us from, I think, all the political machinations that are involved.
I'd also add there that it's interesting to think about the question asking us to think about where the rule of law fits here, because if we come back to this question of which forms of law we see, one of the issues has been, for instance, the EU contracts with the vaccine producers are still commercial in confidence, and there's a lot of pressure from NGOs to try and make them public. I think the EU Ombudsman is currently trying to open some of that up, but most of them haven't been made public. It's very interesting that Oxford wasn't initially going to seek a patent for its vaccine, but it was the Gates Foundation that pushed them to enter into a contract with AstraZeneca. So I think there's an interaction of public and private law here that is producing, enabling this kind of geopolitics that Nick mentioned. And I also think that one of the differences between the North Atlantic, if I could just put it like that, and the rest of the world is that I think many of the rest of us didn't assume that technology would come on a white charger to save us, and that we would have to kind of shore up our health systems in the meantime. Australia, for instance, is a long way down the vaccine queue. We don't have a big cohort like the rest of the EU. So we are a year away, I think, from being anywhere near to vaccines here. And I am not sure how the situation is in Thailand, but I think for many states in our region, there's been a need to have a more social response, in part because technology wasn't reliable. Martti or Gerry, would you like to come in on that?
I just had one very small point here. Oh, sorry, Martti, were you just a tiny point about the idea that there is somewhere out there in the world, it's multilateralism, global governance, or courts that might be able to coherently and in a unified way adjudicate these sorts of disagreements, or between, say, what we're calling vaccine nationalism and some other cooperative global scheme for the distribution of vaccines, because that conflict, I think, lies much deeper, possibly in each of us, in fact. I mean, I find myself worried about two classes of people at the moment. One is those people in states outside Europe and North America who can't get access to the vaccines, and say in Africa. But I also worry a lot about my mother in West Sussex, and I'm wondering why she hasn't had her vaccine yet. And I think that combination of a very local, intimate concern with a sort of global equality is perhaps, it could be sort of paradigmatic in some respects. And it's not something that's always easily adjudicated. We assume it can be.
Well, I just wanted to give a few ideas about what law can, or the rule of law can do here. So we have been thinking of this in terms of securitization or vaccine nationalism, which leads us to a series of geopolitical questions. Now, I was critical of posing questions in geopolitical terms, that what could be the other terms then in which one could pose them. Well, my colleagues who are competition lawyers have been beginning to look at the way in which the medical companies have been promising things they have been unable to deliver, and in general to look at the conditions of competition for the distribution of the medicine, and the different parties that had access to the relevant contracts, and at what time and on what conditions. So competition law is a boring technical aspect of law, but it's out there. Then there's intellectual property law. And during the AIDS crisis, a lot of conversation took place directly between the countries of the global south and medical companies on compulsory licensing, with the idea of compulsory licensing working in the background as a pressure for diminishing the prices of the AIDS medicines. So there are, and so intellectual property negotiations have been underway in TRIPS for a long time, and they haven't really moved much. Well, the question is whether one could use this situation, this crisis, whether it opens an opportunity to discuss those kinds of questions. I make these points about competition law and intellectual property law merely to say that it's often, above all, to say that it's often useful to try to find these technical avenues in which law can be more concretely helpful than in large thinking about law's role in geopolitical organization.
All right. And we have actually a couple more questions here. So may I call Peter from the World Bank, please?
Certainly, and hopefully everybody can hear me. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you so much also for the thought-provoking and insightful presentations. I am working at the World Bank. At the same time, I would like to pose this question as rather a former student of international relations. And I would argue that I might even be an enthusiast, maybe even a connoisseur of international relations. So I wanted to get your perspective more on international relations theory a little bit. And as you might have seen it in the chat, what I was curious to hear more is that considering how much international relations theory has changed over the course of the past decades, stemming from the realist, liberal, constructivist schools, and ever since, as the world has been changing a lot, the theories have been adjusted. So I would be curious to hear, what do you think would be an appropriate way to examine international relations in light of these theories? Is it one of those? Is it an amalgamation of some of these? Is it a new one? Is it recycling some part of it? So I would love to hear from you on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So we are coming to about 10 minutes or so from here. It would be great to hear from everyone, but we will be, I think, cutting the responses shorter and kind of succinctly now. Martti, you're famously skeptical about IR theory, so let's start with you.
Gerry, please keep it brief.
Well, I just briefly say it's too early to say. Too early to say.
Too early in the morning, 1 a.m. here, or too early in the history of the world? Okay, Gerry.
Well, I'm also going to be very, very brief. I had my international relations, international law phase about 10 years ago, so or even longer. So I don't really feel qualified to comment on these endless sort of inter-paradigm debates amongst international relations scholars. So I'm going to defer to Nick on this one as well.
Okay, Nick, I think you're the answer. You still got mute on, but we will look to you for the solution here.
I think, like with any discipline or profession, being as least dogmatic as possible is probably helpful. And I think unfortunately, IR theory can be taught as a series of dogmas, or it can be taught in a way to make you think critically about power and security. And I always like to subscribe to the latter. I think what you're witnessing is a real-time demolition of what security is. What does it mean? What is a threat? What is power? And so in that sense, I don't think it's about a new theory or which one's more applicable. It really goes to the core matter of reevaluating what is security and what it entails. You had some very interesting work recently on, even a few years back, on the pharmaceuticalization of security, which we're really living in right now. So yeah, I wouldn't be bothered about a particular theory or paradigm or approach. There are bits and pieces of all of them that can be useful. We don't need to reinvent a new theory necessarily.
I would add that the moment we're living through does help us to think hard about how any theory we develop or any abstraction or concept that we make use of is very much grounded in the world in which we come up with it. And so that I think very strong sense of grounding that we all have right now can help us read those old texts, not to offer a source of dogma, but perhaps to think about, well, what was the world in which that person was writing that text, and what can we take from it that might speak to this moment without trying to turn it into a dogma. I think IR as a discipline is very committed to this kind of making of schools. We all have our obsessions and that one seems a little alien, at least to me, but I often learn an enormous amount from the texts themselves rather than the dogma into which they've been turned.
All right, and we have actually two person to ask question, and actually two question in text. So I'm not sure if you can manage it in like 5-6 minutes from now. So maybe I just ask them to really give a briefly question. Gerry and Mark, I think there will be two for the question, please.
Okay, hi, good evening. So I'm Gerry. My question is, I want to know your opinion on the relationship between regionalism and multilateralism, or the relationship between pluralism and multilateralism. I'm asking this question because I'm currently working for United Nations Environment Program as an international legal advisor in public procurement in its project in Central Europe, and also as consultant for public procurement and infrastructure for OECD's project in Northern Africa. Because I have noticed that during the pandemic, what the public procurers failed to foresee is that why they don't have multilateral agreement in public procurement, the private sector has what you called as multilateralism insofar as global supply chain. That is why they weren't able to actually procure the emergency PPE because the global supply chain was affected. And now the immediate concern, a reaction of most of the countries, like for example, the US recently announced through its new president that it will increase domestic preference in public procurement, which would have an effect on multilateralism insofar as private sector global supply chain. And in EU, the immediate reaction is through framework agreements among countries in EU, which is in a way a sort of regionalism. So it's like I'm trying to understand what is the relationship between multilateralism and regionalism. Is regionalism, let's say, would that prevent multilateralism? Or how about pluralism? We only have one agreement in terms of public procurement, the WTO GPA, and China has been an observer for more than years. And because it could not be a member, what it was doing is entering bilateral agreement insofar as public procurement is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it would be useful to take the second question and then we'll put both questions to the panelists to finish with.
Okay, good evening. I'm Mark Jaranbong. I'm a provincial public prosecutor of the research institutions for developing investigation and trial procedure in Thailand. First of all, I would like to thank for your four speakers, and the question is very difficult. Luckily, I'm not one of the panelists for answering your questions, Professor Orford. May I ask the questions? As far as I know, I thought the multilateralism is situated on the basis of intergovernmental cooperative structure. And for these reasons, I thought that global governance can use international legal apparatuses to oblige for all countries around the globe, and particularly when we confront with the global crisis as in COVID pandemic. So I thought it, as far as I know, and as far as I understand, if I concluded that multilateralism or the multi-stakeholderism, as the Professor Orford mentioned, is not suitable for for solving the global crisis. And my question is, which model should more suitable for solving the global crisis? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Nick, I wonder if I could put those two questions to you to start with.
Okay, well, they're very difficult. I think I remember Mark from a time back. We might have been in a seminar. So although
thank you.
I would say, look, the short and quick approach to both questions would be, instead of asking what is regionalism, what is multilateralism in the proper, and this kind of builds off what Gerry said at much earlier in the session. Why don't we just focus on what particular actors are doing with the word at a particular time, right? And in that way, you learn more about how in a particular instance, regionalism or multilateralism is being used by whom and for what purpose, rather than trying to find and pin down the dictionary definition of what the word is, right? You can almost say that if multilateralism is a grammar is a living thing. It is exercise, it is practice, it is manipulated, right? So in that way, I'm not so, I wouldn't suggest that you need to pin down a meaning. Look at the doing of how it is performed.
Thanks. Gerry.
I'm going now to agree with Nick now that he's agreed with me. I think we get sometimes too hung up on some of this stuff. I mean, having said that the naming process is vitally important, I also think we as theorists of the international sometimes get too hung up on what we call the sort of dogma of naming. And we need to think about who wins and who loses in which places. And I go back to the sort of crisis of sovereignty and regionalism that I feel like I'm in the heart of at the moment with the potential splitting off of Scotland, the continuing disputes with the European Union and so on. These seem to have revealed a very, very deep and sharp politics at the heart of what would sometimes seem to be rather dry conceptual thoughts about regionalism, multilateralism, and so on. But I just say one more thing about this subject, which is that I think we need to hold on both to a complexity of thought around them and a sort of, if I could put it in these terms, a childlike instinct we all have and share about the deep-seated inequalities that exist in the societies in which we live in and in global society. It's somehow putting these two together or bringing them into some sort of relationship that works well, for me at least, when I try and think through these sometimes deeply inscrutable and difficult problems.
Thanks, Gerry. And Martti.
Well, disappointingly, I agree with both of the previous speakers, but I also maybe having agreed with them, so you need to know who's speaking, what sort of ideas are behind it, what do you want to do with those words. Having said that, there is a historical experience, however, which one should maybe bear in mind, which is that regionalism often leads to the hegemony of the regional great power, and that smaller powers in a region often have a good interest in multilateralism. And the great power will want to call its hegemonic exploits regionalism, and then it will have a central role in the region. This certainly is the case with African regionalism, it's the case with Latin American regionalism, and it's the case of European regionalism. This is not to condemn regional approaches, sometimes they are useful, but it's to bear in mind that that particular vocabulary has a historical set of experiences with it.
Thanks, Martti. So unfortunately, we're now out of time for questions. I think you can see that in the chat, you've been invited still to type questions in and the team will collect them and send them to us afterwards. So thank you everyone who's sent us these excellent questions. You can see, I think that they caused a lot of thought. So at this point, I'm going to invite David also to join me, and we are going to make some closing comments.
Great, Anne, thanks so much. Wow, that was a fantastic conversation. And I've been just sitting here thinking, what did I learn anyway? What did I learn about multilateralism, about law, about the geopolitics of crisis from our panelists? So about multilateralism, my takeaways would be multilateralism is not necessarily where you think it is in the UN. It could be in lots of places, in the private realm, in the comparison between national solutions, which our next webinars will look at more directly, in global value chains and private arrangements. We'll have a webinar also on that. Someone in the chat suggested the significance of cities as a locus also of global problem solving, and thinking of the relationship between cities as a site of multilateralism. So multilateralism not where you think it is. Multilateralism not necessarily as cooperative or tranquil, but as a space where struggle also happens, where there are winners and losers. Multilateralism not as centralized, but as decentralized. In the chat, someone proposed having a look at Parab Khanna's recent book on connectography, as he calls it, which is in a way kind of Anne-Marie Slaughter squared, thinking about the intense interrelationship among a whole variety of different actors in the world. And in particular, we didn't talk much about it, but the role of people like all of you, of experts, expertise, the technical arrangements and relationships between, for example, emerging leaders who've been part of this program over the years, in your relationships with one another going forward. That's also a kind of multilateral or multilateral possibility. And then finally, I learned about multilateralism. It's not a destiny, it's a choice in thinking about various different sorts of issues. So anyway, those are some of my takeaways. I guess on law, what did I learn about law? I think it's a kind of two contradictory ideas, really. So on the one hand, law is bigger and more important than you think. It's already everywhere in the background of things, not only a tool to come in on top and regulate or solve problems, but in the background defining the public, the private, what a corporation is and can do and so forth. And so it's a tool to change how the international system is arranged. Competition law, property law, as Martti Koskenniemi said, may be more important in looking at some problems than global treaties might be. What else did I learn about law? I learned law is not the only way to do things, sort of some of the opposite from being everywhere. Law is more limited, or should be, than we think. Gerry drew our attention to the idea that courts can't and probably shouldn't adjudicate every kind of global problem, and international institutions ought not try to solve every problem with a legal solution. And then I guess finally that law is not just a good thing, that law can also be part of how problems get made worse, which is one of the reasons we need to be examining specific legal arrangements to see whether or not they need to be changed as we focus on global crises. I don't know, Anne, what else was there? What about geopolitics and global crises? Very interesting conversation. I guess what I learned there most directly is that our old way of thinking, that there's multilateralism and law on the one hand, and there's geopolitics on the other as the context or resistance, is just not right. That the two things are much more closely related than that. So geopolitics, however we define it, the politics of the earth, operates also through legal institutional arrangements, that multilateralism is a site in which geopolitics and geopolitical struggles occur as much as it is an alternative to those struggles. I think that's an interesting reframing of the whole understanding of how the rule of law itself fits into our understanding of the relationship between the US and China, say, and the position of other countries in relationship to that struggle. And it's not either China or the United States will be the carrier of the rule of law and the other will be the site of politics, but rather there's a struggle going on in the world, that among many others, that are legal, that have their cooperative dimensions, that are political, that are economic, that are carried out also by private actors, in which these big units we call states are also subject to pressure, to alternative kinds of powers. So, you know, the president of the United States is taken off Twitter and Facebook by some guy, some billionaire who decides that the president can no longer speak. It's a striking moment for realizing the significance of private power as a regulator. So it was a really fascinating discussion. And so many good questions in the chat that we didn't get the chance to get to. I guess as I look at the overall story here, I'd say in past emerging leader programs that we've done, the most interesting discussions really were not those among the faculty. The most interesting discussions were those that all of you will have with each other over the course of these months as you confront these questions in the particular kinds of settings and situations and problems that you've all been engaged with in your own practice. So I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these issues in the next webinars, and certainly when we're all together in Bangkok, health permitting, in June. But it's been really terrific. And I don't know, what did you learn? Did you have some sort of sense of how it all fits together?
David, I think you really masterfully characterized everything I would have taken away from it. I guess there's a couple of questions that would remain open for me. One is the sense that the private is the real realm of multilateralism, and that private power is the real power. And you kind of gestured to it then with, wow, so you know, the Twitter guy can take the president of the United States, can take him off. And I was interested looking at the World Economic Forum website. I went there expecting to see, wow, this is the real place where it's all going to happen. And it looked just like a jazzier UN, but not really all that much more interesting. I know you've actually been at Davos rather than just looking at the website, but I do think there's a tendency that we have to think the real place it's happening is the private. And it's interesting to watch now with COVID, how we are seeing states or, you know, coalitions of states really using power in tandem with corporations, of course, to achieve certain things. So it's interesting to watch when and where the private and the public are working together and how they're doing that. The other theme that I felt emerged also from the questions was the relation between these big dogmatic claims or abstract ideas or isms, multilateralism, regionalism, the rule of law, and then what they're being used to do at any particular point. And this is something that I do take away from the work of David and others, that it's the movement between the two that's really important. It's not, we shouldn't think the abstract or we should only think in the concrete, but all the time we move between those two things. And that's what's really interesting. So how is this generalist abstract idea being used to justify something? This is the right thing to happen because it's multilateral and we're all committed to that, aren't we? That's the good thing to do. So therefore we get all the stuff and we get to take it. Or, you know, the other way around, this is national and we're for the national, aren't we? So that means we get to do this thing. But what's really interesting is the move between those two ideas. So I think that was one of the responses we saw in the questions and the answers, is how you think that relation between the abstract and the concrete.
I mean, and I think that insight that you raise about the relation between the national and the multilateral and how the boundary is drawn and moves back and forth, it's also true for the public and the private. I think we've kind of overstated the distinction in order to foreground the significance of private actors in governing, but it's also something of a mistake to imagine that corporations and states are all that different and are not always intertwined with one another. So there are a variety of different ways in which states are regulators and corporations are regulators and undertake what we would normally understand to be governance functions. But they're also always entwined with the state in a variety of ways. They're the creation of states, and public powers are really significant in the way in which they're organized. In fact, originally corporations were an agent of the state, incorporated for the pursuit of public purposes. And so we could say they still are. The public purpose is the purpose of their pursuing whatever it is that the law defines as what they need to be doing in order to be meeting their duties to shareholders and so on. And similarly, states are no longer some public sovereign sitting on top of all the private actors. They're very deeply intertwined with the economic leadership and so forth of states. So when you go to Davos, one of the things that's interesting is it's very hard to figure out who the public people are and who the private people are. They're all talking to each other as if they're part of a common ruling technocratic group. On the other hand, if you go and ask any one of them, well, say, I see you're a global ruler, I just wondered what you were going to do. They all say, well, no, it's not me, really. you don't understand the pressures we're under. There's the stakeholders and the workers, and there are the other countries, and we follow the law of the places where we operate, and there's the state and so forth. So there's this combined sense of the significance and responsibility of a variety of actors, and some ability of all these actors to dissociate themselves from decision-making and political significance when it suits them. And so that sense of occupying and not occupying governance is also a choice. It's also, someone gets on the stage and says, I am now going to solve this problem. This is now a global problem. And then someone else says, well, no, you're not, I am, or nobody is, and so forth. So those kinds of assertions are also part of how the space we're talking about is made and remade. And those are strategies that people have who want a particular approach to vaccine distribution or whatever. It's been very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting.
All right. Hi. All right. So I think that probably concludes our session today. Thanks a lot for David, for bringing all the great speakers, with us today. Thanks to our panelists, for your rich discussion. We've learned a lot. And thanks to Anne, especially for our excellent, moderation today. So before we end the session of today, please allow me to remind you to return the evaluation form that you will be receiving via email. And your feedback is very important for us to improve our program. And the next session of the global webinar will be scheduled on Thursday, the 11th of February, on the topic of the criminal justice reform. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.